Before we go into Phrygian and explore our third mode, I want to talk about something that's very important for you to understand. It's a phenomenon of human hearing called tonal persistence. This is basically a function of human perception that helps a listener hear a certain note or chord, or sometimes some other musical structure, as the tonic. In other words, as you hear a piece of music, something begins to sound like home base. And that something is usually a note called the tonic, and with it a chord called the tonic chord. Remember how I kind of demonstrated that in lesson 1? We talked about how you can convince a listener to hear a chord as the tonic by emphasizing it and by coming back to it often. And now you expect the tonic. So if you manipulate your chord progression the right way, usually after a few seconds you convince the listener to hear a chord as the tonic. That's tonal persistence. But different modes and their corresponding tonic chords have different degrees of stability or instability or tension built into their sound. That's because of the intervals between the rest of the notes and the tonic. The most obvious example is the Locrian mode. We will look at this mode in more detail later, but right now, hear how the Locrian tonic chord sounds. There's tension in it already without even relating it to other chords. That's why it's harder to convince the listener to hear this as the tonic. You may be trying to write a Locrian song, but just moving to the next chord up makes that one sound like the tonic and messes up what you're trying to do. What I played didn't sound like 1-2. It sounded like 7-1. So it takes special care to create a convincing Locrian tonality. And that's why there are very few Locrian songs out there. Of course, if you do make it, the result is a cool, unusual sound. Usually what you need to do is to stay on that minor 7 flat 5 chord, the Locrian tonic chord, a long time and barely move from it. Now I used Locrian as an example because it's the most extreme case. It's the most difficult mode to create tonal persistence with. On the other end of the spectrum, you have Ionian, which is the easiest one. That's why it was so popular in the classical period. They liked to change keys or tonalities a lot, and with Ionian, or major as it's usually called, it takes just a couple of chords to convince the listener that they are in a new tonality. That's also why Ionian or major is so popular in jazz. Again, in most jazz styles, switching keys is very common, and with Ionian or major, you can convince the listener with a couple of chords. Modal jazz, on the other hand, refers to jazz that favors modes other than the Ionian, and music in this style stays on one chord most of the time. So Locrian is the hardest mode to create modal persistence with, and Ionian is the easiest. The other 5 modes fall somewhere in between. I'm just going to throw in another piece of information just to make you aware of something, but I'm not going to elaborate because that's outside the scope of this lesson. Have you heard of the harmonic minor scale? Well, the reason this scale evolved in classical music is that they were looking for a way to make a minor mode have the same powerful tonal characteristics as Ionian. So they made a modification to the Aeolian mode, also known as the natural minor, so that you can establish it with a couple of chords, just like Ionian. I'm not going to go into more detail right now, but hopefully now you can understand why people use the terms major scale and minor scale so much. Instead of talking about modes, they're usually referring to the Ionian and Aeolian with its harmonic minor modifications. The Ionian mode, or the major scale, is so versatile and easy to establish that it has become much more popular than Lydian and Mixolydian, which are also major sounding modes. To make things clear, all three of these modes have a major tonic chord, so all three could be called major, but popularity vote gave the name just to the Ionian mode. So when you hear someone say that a song is in a major key, you should assume that 99% of the time it's going to be Ionian. And the same thing happened with Aeolian, with the harmonic minor modification and also the melodic minor modification. It became just as versatile and usable as Ionian. So if you hear that a song is in a minor key, you can safely assume that 99% of the time it's going to be in Aeolian plus some modifications. You see, the modal names have been around for centuries, long before major and minor became so popular. Classical harmony came out of modal harmony and then developed. And right now, in modern music, things are so free that you hear all kinds of music, major, minor, modal, in other strange ethnic scales and modes and so on. Even the harmonic minor and the melodic minor, which used to be seen as modifications to Aeolian, now stand as scales on their own, and we study their modes. In the EMP backing track library, you'll find modal backing tracks for those as well. So anyway, our point was tonal persistence. A tonic chord is established in the perception of a listener, and he or she starts to hear it as home base. Sometimes in songs, after you hear 2 or 3 verses and choruses, the tonality is so well established that the composer can make a whole contrasting section called the bridge. Even if this bridge section emphasizes different chords and is several bars long, the tonality in the mind of the listener still remains because of the verses and the choruses they heard before. And when you do go back to the tonic, it still sounds like home. This is very common. Next time you hear your favorite songs, pay attention and you will most likely hear this happening.